So what if one of the most laughed at scientific warnings of the entire 20th century actually turned out to be right? Well, today we're going to dig into a 50-year-old report that, you'll see, is maybe more relevant now than it's ever been.
Okay, so our story really kicks off with this warning from ancient myth. You've got Cassandra, right? The prophetess who was cursed to always tell the truth, but to never, ever be believed. And man, is that a fitting metaphor for the very modern story we're about to get into.
And that really makes you wonder, doesn't it? It brings up this huge question, something people call the Cassandra effect. I mean, what does happen when a warning about our future is so profound and uncomfortable that we as a society just choose to ignore it? What happens when we just look away?
All right, so let's jump in our time machine and head back to 1972. You've got this group of scientists from MIT, right? They're working with a think tank called the Club of Rome, and they published this study, The Limits to Growth. And their goal? Wow, it was beyond ambitious. They wanted to build a computer model of the entire world.
And get this, for the very first time, they used a computer model to try and simulate how these massive global forces all interact with each other. We're talking about 5 key things here: population, how much stuff we're making, so industrial growth, food production, pollution, and of course, the fact that we live on a planet with a limited amount of resources. So, the method they use for this whole thing is called system dynamics. And, you shouldn't think of it like a simple A leads to B kind of thing. It's way more like a giant, complicated spider web. It models how all the different parts of a system, say population and resources, push and pull on each other over time. This creates these feedback loops that can lead to totally surprising results you just never see coming if you were only looking at one little piece of the puzzle.
And what the model spit out of the end? Well, it was an absolute bombshell. It showed that if we just kept on with business as usual, this endless chase for growth on a planet that's, finite, it could lead to a really sharp decline sometime in the 21st century. Now, let's be super clear about this. They weren't saying the world is ending. This wasn't some doomsday prediction. It was a warning. It was them saying, hey, look at the path we're on.
Now, the report sold millions and millions of copies, but the backlash? Oh man, it was immediate and it was brutal. What was supposed to be this serious, thought-provoking warning was almost overnight turned into a punchline.
Economists especially just tore it to shreds. They were absolutely scathing. Their big argument was that the model was just way too pessimistic. They said it totally failed to account for human ingenuity, for all the amazing technological progress we make, and for, the magic of the market to just sort of fix any problem that comes along. And what's so interesting is that a huge part of the backlash really zeroed in on one single table in the entire book. Critics grabbed these numbers and ran with them, saying, see, they made these super specific predictions about when we'd run out of gold or oil or whatever. And of course, those predictions were eventually proven wrong, which seemed to discredit the whole thing. But here's the kicker. This was a total misreading of what the authors were actually trying to say. They were crystal clear in the book. Those numbers were not predictions. They were just an illustration, like an extreme example to show the ridiculous logical conclusion of just letting exponential growth run wild. So the very numbers that everyone used to disprove the study, yeah, they came from a scenario the authors themselves said was unrealistic. Wild, right?
Okay, so to really get the point that pretty much everyone missed, we kind of have to wrap our heads around this idea of thinking in systems. And you know what? The book itself gives us a perfect real-world example to help us do just that.
Let's look at the American whaling industry back in the 19th century. It had this incredible boom. I mean, it just exploded. And then, almost just as fast, it completely collapsed. A total bust. And the reason why wasn't some single thing. It was a classic feedback loop. Kind of like a dance between the hunters and the hunted.
So check out how this feedback loop worked. First, you build more ships. That's your capital. To go hunt more whales. Simple enough. But because you're so good at it, the whale population, that's your resource, starts to plummet. Then, because there are fewer whales, it gets way harder and more expensive to find them, so profits start to fall. And finally, with those lower profits, you can't build or maintain as many ships, and boom, the whole industry collapses. It's a perfect bite-sized example of the exact same kind of system the limits to growth was talking about, just, for the entire planet.
So for decades, this whole study was just seen as a total failure, completely discredited. But in the last few years, now that we have the benefit of hindsight, some researchers have actually gone back to the original model. They wanted to see how it stacks up against what really happened in the world. Yeah, you heard that right. We now have more than 50 years of actual real-world data to look at. We can literally check their homework from 1972. We can see how those old-school computer simulations actually compare to reality. I mean, it's this incredibly rare chance to see if that Cassandra-Reich warning was onto something or not.
So, here's the million-dollar question, right? How did that base case scenario, the business-as-usual one that got so torn apart, how did it actually hold up against the real world? Well, let me tell you, the results are pretty startling.
When you actually take the graphs of the real-world data for things like population, industrial output, resource use, and pollution, and you lay them right over the top of the original model's business-as-usual trajectory from 1972, the alignment is, well, it's just shockingly close. It turns out the path we've actually been on as a planet has been tracking that initial warming with remarkable accuracy.
And it's not just one person saying this. Recent analyses have found what they call a remarkably good correspondence between that base case scenario and the real historical data. So that warning, the one that was dismissed and laughed at for decades, well, it appears to have been tracking with reality a whole lot more closely than its critics ever imagined. And all of this brings us to one last, really big question. What is a model even for? Is it supposed to be a crystal ball that perfectly predicts the future? Or is it something else? A tool to help us actually see the complex systems we're living inside of? I mean, if the authors themselves said it wasn't a prediction, then what was the point of it all? And maybe that's the real legacy of the limits to growth. It's about what we stand to lose when we dismiss a warning just because we don't like the sound of it. Maybe its greatest value was never about predicting the future, but about giving us a chance to change it, a chance that, by turning it all into a punchline, we might have missed. And that's a thought that should give us all pause.